The cabin door creaks open in the Wyoming dawn. A man named Jesse Hale steps onto the porch, tasting freedom on the cold air. But freedom isn't what's waiting for him. Silas Boone is standing in the yard. His Colt revolver gleams like a sliver of ice in the morning mist. "Hello, Jesse Hale." Two more hunters step out from the shadows of the barn, rifles leveled. The trap, it seems, was set all night. Jesse's hand hovers over the butt of his own gun. It's the same hand that traced the lines of Eleanor Whitlow's face just hours ago. The same hand that learned, finally, how to stay instead of run. Inside the cabin, a woman watches through the window. Eleanor. She's 51 years old, silver weaving through her auburn hair, and she's clutching her dead husband's Winchester rifle like a prayer. She thought she was too old for this, too old for the kind of love that makes a good man choose a bad death. But here they are, the bounty hunter, the outlaw, and the widow. Three lives tangled together by one night of forbidden fire, and the price for that fire is about to be paid in blood. Winter in Dry Willow wasn't just a season, it was a sentence. Eleanor Whitlow felt it in her bones as she split kindling, her breath coming in white puffs of smoke. 7 years, 7 years since she'd put her husband Jacob in the ground. Her life since then had been a clockwork of solitude. Chores at dawn, mending by the fire, prayers that felt more like reciting lists than talking to God. She'd look at his photograph on the mantel sometimes, a stern man, frozen in time. Then she'd look away. Some ghosts were too heavy to carry in the daylight. Above the hearth, his Winchester rifle gathered dust. Jacob's gun, Jacob's rules, Jacob's woman. Even from the grave, he owned this place. He owned her. She saw the hoof prints then, fresh, a single set, leading right to her door, not from a horse that belonged to anyone in the valley, a stranger's tracks, and they were staggering, unsteady. Night had already fallen, and the stranger was already here. She heard him before she saw him. A heavy boot dragging through the snow, a labored, ragged breath, and then the soft, heavy thud of a body slumping against her front door. Eleanor froze, her hand closing around the iron fire poker. Decent women, lone women, didn't open their doors after dark. Not in this wilderness. Not for anyone. The knock came again, but it was weaker this time. A desperate scratching sound. She held her breath. One heartbeat. Two. Three. Then her hand, moving as if it had a mind of its own, turned the latch. He practically fell into the room, a whirlwind of snow and cold air. Jesse Hale. He couldn't have been more than 27, with a rugged handsomeness carved by hard miles and harder choices. A dark stain of blood was spreading down his pant leg. His eyes, the color of a gathering storm, met hers. They held a million things, but not a single ounce of pleading. "Ma'am," his voice was a low rasp, like sandpaper and whiskey. "Just need a place for the night. I won't be any trouble." Eleanor's eyes flicked down to the Colt revolver strapped to his hip, then back up to his face. An outlaw. He had to be. But something in those gray eyes, something beyond the pain, stopped her from slamming the door in his face. It was something that felt familiar. "One night," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Leave the gun on the porch. And don't you dare lie to me. I can smell a lie like smoke on the wind." He gave a slow, weary nod. He unbuckled the gun belt without a word, laying the heavy weapon carefully on the porch rail, right where she could see it. "There are men looking for me," he admitted, "but I don't shoot first, and I never shoot the innocent." A half-truth, maybe. Most of what men like him said were half-truths, but for tonight it was enough. She led him to the armchair by the fire, her movements practiced and efficient. She fetched her sewing kit, clean rags, and a bottle of Jacob's old whiskey. The bullet, she saw, had torn a nasty furrow through his thigh. Deep enough to be dangerous, but shallow enough that a steady hand could fix it. "This is going to hurt," she warned, threading a needle in the flickering firelight. He just looked at the flames. "Already does." Her hands didn't shake as she cleaned the wound. They were surer and steadier than they had been in years. When was the last time she had touched another person with such purpose? When had anyone needed her quiet competence, her calm strength? Jesse gritted his teeth. his knuckles white on the arm of the chair, but he never made a sound. Good. She hated men who made a theater out of their pain. Jacob had been like that. "You'll sleep on the floor by the fire," she told him when the last stitch was tied. "My bedroom door stays closed, and tomorrow, you're gone. We don't ever speak of this." "Understood," he murmured, his eyes heavy with exhaustion and gratitude. But later, as she lay in her own cold bed, Eleanor found herself listening to the sound of his breathing in the other room. And before she fell asleep, she got up and pushed her bedroom door open. Just a crack. Just enough to hear if he moved. Just enough to see the firelight play across his sleeping face. Just enough to wonder what it felt like to be needed again. Not as a wife, not as a memory, but as a woman. And she wondered why the sight of a wounded outlaw sleeping by her fire made her feel safer than she had in 7 years of sleeping alone with a good man's gun hanging on the wall. The first light of dawn was pale and quiet. Eleanor woke not to the silence she was used to, but to a sound she hadn't heard in years. The clean, rhythmic thwack of an axe splitting wood. It was a steady, powerful sound. The sound of a man who knew his way around hard work. She crept to her window and looked out. There he was. Jesse. He'd found one of Jacob's old wool coats in a chest by the door. The sleeves were too short for his long arms, but he didn't seem to mind the cold. He put his weight on his injured leg with only a slight wince, swinging the axe with an easy, economical grace that was almost beautiful to watch. Each swing sent a spray of wood chips into the frosty air. Eleanor found herself watching the play of muscles across his back, a sight so foreign and so alive. When she finally stepped outside with 2 steaming mugs of coffee, he stopped. He straightened up, wiping a sheen of sweat from his brow with the back of his glove. "Didn't want to be a useless guest," he said, his voice clearer than the night before. "Figured I owed you for the doctorin'." "You don't owe me a thing," she said, handing him a mug. "My mother raised me better than that." Their fingers brushed as he took the coffee, a simple touch that sent a jolt of warmth through the cold morning. This time, neither of them pulled away right away. "Tell me about her," Eleanor said, the words surprising her. "Your mother." A shadow of a smile touched Jesse's lips. "Mary Hale. She was a school teacher in a town so small it never got a name. Could recite poetry while she skinned a rabbit. Could make a Sunday dinner for 2 stretched to feed any soul who happened by." He took a sip of the hot coffee, his gaze distant. "Fever took her when I was 16. Happened fast. I'm sorry." "She'd have liked you," he said, looking at her directly now. His gray eyes were clear and sharp in the morning light. "She would have said you had kind eyes. She could always see the good in people, even when they couldn't see it in themselves." A strange heat bloomed in Eleanor's chest, a feeling she hadn't felt in a decade. It was unsettling. I need to ride into town. For supplies." It was a lie. She had plenty, but she needed to get away from him, away from those eyes. She needed distance. In Prue Landon's general store, however, distance was the last thing you could find. Gossip and dry willow flew faster than a telegraph wire and hit harder than a stray bullet. Prue's sharp little eyes tracked every item Eleanor placed on the counter. Extra bandages, a bigger tin of coffee, a jar of honey. "Stocking up for a long winter, Eleanor?" Prue asked, her voice syrupy sweet. "That's a lot of supplies for one person." "Winter's been hard," Eleanor replied, keeping her voice even, her eyes on the flour sacks behind the counter, but she could feel another pair of eyes on her. From a dark corner of the store, a man was watching, a tall, weathered man with the coiled stillness of a wolf. She'd never seen him before. He wasn't from the valley. When their gazes met for a split second, he gave a slow, deliberate tip of his hat. It wasn't a friendly gesture. It was a gesture of assessment. A predator marking its territory. A chill that had nothing to do with the weather snaked down Eleanor's spine. She paid for her things and hurried out, the man's cold eyes feeling like they were boring into her back. The ride home felt different. The familiar trees seemed to hold new shadows. Every snap of a twig sounded like a footstep. She urged her horse faster, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. She found Jesse not by the fire but by her front door, carefully mending the broken hinge. He had his sleeves rolled up, and she could see his forearms were corded with muscle and crisscrossed with old faded scars. Each scar told a story she didn't know. "Thought I heard riders earlier," he said, not looking up from his work. He spoke casually, but there was a new tension in his voice. "Up on the ridge. Might just be hunters, or it might not." He tested the newly fixed hinge, swinging the door back and forth. It moved without a sound. "Either way, I should be moving on. Soon. My leg's feeling stronger thanks to you." He finally straightened up and turned to face her. Suddenly, the space between them felt very small. "Staying here any longer just puts you in danger, Eleanor. I won't have that on my conscience." Hearing him say her name, just her name, sent that strange warmth spiraling through her all over again. "What if I said I wasn't ready for you to go?" The words were out before she could stop them. They hung in the air, fragile and dangerous. Something in his expression shifted, softened. "Ma'am, Eleanor?" He said her name like it was a word he was tasting for the first time. "I'm not a good man to get tangled up with." She took a step closer, close enough to feel the heat coming off his body. "Maybe I'll be the judge of that." The afternoon sun slanted low through the pines, casting long shadows across the yard. The world seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what they would do next. The air crackled with unspoken things, with the dangerous, thrilling possibility of a life she'd long since buried. And in that quiet moment, Eleanor realized she wasn't afraid of the outlaw in front of her. She was afraid of the silence that would come when he was gone. That afternoon was a strange dance, a dance around the truth. Eleanor showed him which herbs to brew into a tea to help his leg heal faster. He took the Winchester down from the wall and showed her how to properly clean and oil it, his hands covering hers, guiding her movements. His touch was firm and steady, and his breath was warm against her ear as he explained the rifle's mechanism. They talked for hours, about the books she'd read, the places he'd seen. It was all careful talk, talk that walked right up to the edge of their real lives but never crossed over. As dusk began to settle, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, Jesse insisted on target practice. "Just in case," he said, his expression serious. But she knew it was an excuse to stand close, to extend the day, to put off the inevitable goodbye. He set up a row of old bottles on a fallen log at the edge of the tree line. He stood behind her, his body a warm, solid presence against her back. He adjusted her stance, his hands on her shoulders, then on her arms, guiding her grip on the heavy rifle stock. "Breathe out slow," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her ear. "Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it." The first shot went wide. The second kicked up snow a foot to the left. Eleanor felt a surge of frustration. "I can't do this." "Yes, you can," he said softly. "You're just thinking too much. Feel it. Don't think." He put his hand over hers on the stock. Again. This time, she closed her eyes for a second, took a deep breath, and squeezed. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and a split second later, the sharp, satisfying crash of shattering glass echoed through the quiet woods. She'd hit it, dead center. A laugh bubbled up out of her, a bright, genuine sound she hadn't heard from herself in years. "I did it! You're a natural," Jesse said, his voice thick. She turned to him, her face flushed with triumph, and found he wasn't looking at the broken bottle. He was looking at her, at the color in her cheeks, at the way her eyes sparkled. The air between them grew taut, stretched thin like a bowstring about to snap. The whole world seemed to shrink down to the few inches of space separating them. He lifted his hand slowly, as if not to spook a wild thing, and his thumb gently traced the curve of her cheekbone. His touch was rough, calloused, but it sent a tremor through her entire body. "Eleanor," he whispered, and her name was a question, a plea, a confession all in one. She leaned into his touch, a silent surrender. "I know I should be afraid of you." "You should," he agreed, his voice barely audible. "But I'm not." She met his gaze, her heart hammering against her ribs. "The only thing I'm afraid of right now is how alive you make me feel." That was it. That was the thing that broke him. Jesse's control shattered into a million pieces. His mouth came down on hers, not gentle, not tentative, but with a raw, desperate hunger that mirrored her own. It was the kiss of a starving man, and she realized in that moment that she was starving too. Her arms wrapped around his neck, her fingers tangling in his dark hair, pulling him closer. He tasted of coffee and cold air, and the impossible promise of a new beginning. When they finally broke apart, gasping for air, the rifle lay forgotten in the snow between them. The sun had dipped below the mountains. "We should go inside," Jesse said, his voice rough with emotion. Eleanor could only nod, not trusting herself to speak. As they walked back towards the warm, inviting light of the cabin, she reached into her coat pocket and her fingers closed around the familiar, smooth circle of her wedding ring. Without a second thought, she slipped it off and let it drop into the darkness of the pocket. The gold felt cold and heavy, but for the first time in 7 long years, her heart felt warm. But a fire this bright cast deep shadows, and someone was already moving through those shadows, drawn to the light, ready to collect the price for their stolen warmth. That night, the little cabin felt charged, alive with a current of unspoken energy. Every time they brushed past each other in the small space, sparks seemed to fly. After they ate, they sat by the fire, the silence between them comfortable now, intimate. The dancing flames cast their shadows large upon the walls, making them seem like the only two people left in the world. "Tell me something true," Eleanor said, her voice soft. She needed to know him, the real him. Jesse stared into the flames for a long time before he spoke. "I killed a man once, in Cheyenne, a card sharp who was cheating young soldiers out of their pay. I called him on it. He went for his gun." He paused, his jaw tight. "I was faster." He looked up from the fire, his eyes finding hers. "But that's not the worst of it. That's not what keeps me awake at night." Eleanor waited, her hands folded in her lap. "I had a partner, Tom Bradley, a good man, but he had terrible judgment. We, we tried to rob a supply wagon outside Laramie. The territorial governor was hoarding grain while folks were starving. We thought we were doing the right thing." Jesse's voice dropped to a near whisper. "The cavalry showed up. It was a setup. I, I ran. I left Tom to face them alone." "What happened to him?" she asked gently. "They hanged him," Jesse said, the words flat and dead. "Made a big show of it in the town square. A celebration." He finally turned to look at her fully, the self-loathing in his eyes a raw, open wound. "I should have been up there with him, or I should have died trying. But I ran. I was a coward." Eleanor reached across the space between them and took his hand. His skin was rough, but his fingers curled around hers. "You're not a coward now." "How do you know that?" "Because you're still here," she said simply. "You're here with me, even though you know it's dangerous. Even though a better man, a safer man, would have been gone by now." The firelight caught in her hair, turning the silver strands to spun gold. Jesse's breath hitched. "You're so beautiful," he breathed. "I'm an old woman. You're the most beautiful woman I've ever seen." And when he kissed her this time, there was no hesitation, no holding back. It was a kiss of acceptance, of forgiveness. Eleanor melted against him, 7 years of crushing loneliness pouring out of her in a single desperate response. His hands were in her hair, on her back, pulling her flush against him until she could feel the frantic beating of his heart against her own. His lips moved from her mouth to her jaw, down the column of her throat, finding the sensitive spot where her pulse hammered like a trapped bird. "Eleanor," he whispered against her skin, "are you sure about this?" Instead of answering, her shaking fingers went to the buttons of his shirt. He caught her hands, stilling them, forcing her to meet his intense gaze. "If we do this, there's no going back." "I know," she whispered, her voice trembling but firm. "I don't want to go back." That was all he needed to hear. With a low groan, he swept her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. He carried her toward the bedroom, her feet never touching the floor. He kicked the door open and laid her down gently on the quilt she had stitched together in the first lonely year of her widowhood. Moonlight streamed through the single window, bathing her skin in a pale, ethereal light. He undressed her slowly, reverently, his hands worshiping every inch of her. The curve of her waist, the swell of her breasts, the skin that hadn't been touched by a man in 7 years. She arched into his touch, gasping, feeling her body reawaken from a long, cold slumber. This wasn't just lust. It was something deeper. Two broken souls finding a sort of wholeness in each other's arms. He moved on top of her, his eyes locking with hers in the silver moonlight. He was about to, hoofbeats, not one horse, multiple riders. And they were coming fast. In an instant, the spell was shattered. Jesse rolled off her, grabbing for his clothes in the darkness. The primal, urgent need of a hunted man overriding everything else. They scrambled to the front window, peering through a crack in the curtains. 3 riders were pulling up in the yard. The man in the lead was the stranger from the general store. And now, pinned to his coat, was the glint of a deputy's badge. His pale eyes swept over the small cabin like a hawk searching for its prey. "Hide!" Eleanor hissed, her mind racing. "The root cellar. Under the floorboards." She yanked a heavy bearskin rug aside, revealing a small, square trap door. "Get in, now!" He gave her one last, desperate look, then squeezed through the narrow opening. Eleanor dropped the trap door back into place, threw the rug over it, and smoothed her dress with trembling hands just as heavy, spurred boots hit her front porch. The pounding on the door was loud enough to shake the entire cabin. Eleanor took a deep, steadying breath, walked to the door, and lifted the latch. "Evening, ma'am," Silas Boone said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. His cold eyes scanned every corner of the room, missing nothing. He noted the 2 coffee mugs by the hearth. He noted the Winchester, clean and oiled, propped by the door instead of hanging over the mantel. "Cold night for a ride," Eleanor said, her voice tight. "I'm tracking a man," Silas said, his voice a low drawl. He moved through her home like he owned it, his gaze lingering on the rumpled blankets by the fire. "Dangerous sort. Goes by the name of Jesse Hale, about 6 feet tall, dark hair, gray eyes. You haven't seen anyone matching that description, have you?" "No," Eleanor said, her heart a cold stone in her chest. Silas smiled, but it was a smile with no warmth, all teeth. "Funny thing about lies, Mrs. Whitlow. They have a certain smell to them, like desperation and gunpowder." Eleanor's hand instinctively drifted toward the Winchester. "I think you should leave my house. And I think you should tell me where he is." The silence in the cabin was so thick she could feel it pressing in on her. Below her feet, Jessie waited in the suffocating darkness. Above, she faced down a man who would kill for a price, and she had a terrible feeling the bounty on Jessie's head was a high one. "I live alone," she said, her voice like steel. "I have ever since my husband passed on." Silas stared at her for a long, unnerving moment. He seemed to be looking right through her, into the floorboards. Then with a sudden, shockingly fast movement, he drew a long hunting knife from his belt and slammed it, point first into the wooden doorframe, just inches from her head. The blade quivered, humming in the sudden silence. "Just a reminder, ma'am," he whispered, his voice dangerously soft. "The law always finds what it's looking for." He turned and walked out, leaving the knife buried in her door. She listened until the sound of his horse's hoofbeats faded into the frozen night. The second the sound was gone, Eleanor's legs gave out. She collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. With shaking hands, she scrambled to the rug and threw it aside, fumbling with the latch on the trap door. Jesse emerged from the darkness below, his face pale but his eyes burning with a fierce, protective light. He looked at her, at the knife in the door, at the terror on her face, and they came together without a single word. His mouth found hers in a collision of fear and relief, and a desperate, uncontainable need. 7 years of solitude collapsed into 7 seconds of raw, undeniable passion. His hands tangled in her hair, pulling her tight against him, his body a shield against the world. This time, there was no stopping. There was no turning back. They made love on the bearskin rug in front of the dying fire, their movements desperate and tender all at once. It was rough with fear and soft with a kind of wonder. For Eleanor, it was a shattering. Years of pent-up grief and loneliness breaking apart like ice in a spring thaw. Afterwards, they lay tangled in each other's arms, listening to the wind howl outside. His fingers traced lazy circles on her bare shoulder. They didn't speak of the bounty hunter. They didn't speak of tomorrow. There was only the warmth of the fire, the solidness of his body next to hers, and the quiet, steady beat of his heart under her ear. They dozed like that until the first hint of gray dawn touched the window. But the morning light brought the cold, hard reality of their situation crashing back in. They dressed in silence, the intimacy of the night replaced by a heavy, unspoken tension. While Eleanor made coffee, she noticed Jesse staring at the knife still embedded in her doorframe. He pulled it free with a grunt and tested its edge. It was razor sharp. "I have to go," he said, his voice low. "Before he comes back. Staying here puts you in his sights." Eleanor didn't argue. She knew he was right. She wrapped up bread and dried meat in a piece of cloth, her hands steady even as her heart was breaking into 1,000 pieces. "Take Jacob's coat," she said, her voice flat. "It's in the chest. You'll need the warmth." He pulled on the heavy wool coat. It was a better fit than the other one, broader in the shoulders. For a moment, seeing him in her dead husband's coat, a wave of confusion and guilt washed over her. "Come with me," Jesse said suddenly, the words hanging in the air between them. "Eleanor, we could go south. California, maybe. We could find a place where nobody knows our names. Start over." Eleanor caught a glimpse of her reflection in the small mirror by the door. She saw the silver in her hair, the lines etched around her eyes. She saw a 51-year-old woman who hadn't left this valley in 20 years. "I'm too old for running, Jesse." "You're not too old for living," he said, stepping closer. He cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to look at him. "You're not too old for me." But fear was a powerful poison. The fear of Silas Boone was one thing, but the fear of leaving the only life she'd ever known, that was something else entirely. "Go," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, just go." A look of profound sadness crossed his face. He leaned in and kissed her, a kiss that was all tenderness and regret, a kiss that tasted of goodbye. "If I could stay—" "I know," she whispered back. "I know." He turned and opened the door to leave, and Silas Boone was standing right there in the yard. His Colt was already drawn, leveled directly at Jesse's heart. "Hello again, Jesse Hale." From behind the woodshed in the barn, two more men appeared, their rifles also raised. They hadn't left. They had waited all night, hidden in the freezing cold, while she and Jesse had found a lifetime's worth of comfort in each other's arms. The trap had been waiting all along. Eleanor appeared in the doorway behind Jesse, Jacob's Winchester now clutched in her hands, its cold weight a familiar comfort. "Let him go," she said, her voice dangerously quiet. Silas let out a short, harsh laugh that sounded like rocks grinding together. "Ma'am, you are now an accomplice, harboring a known fugitive. By rights, I could take you both in." Jesse held up a hand, a slow, placating gesture, but his eyes never left Silas. "This has nothing to do with her. Let her be." "Oh, I think she has everything to do with this," Silas said, his pale eyes flickering between them. He took in the sight of Jesse wearing another man's coat. He saw the way Eleanor stood just a little too close to him. The intimacy clung to them like wood smoke. "Question is, Jesse, what's she worth to you?" Jesse didn't hesitate. "Everything." "Interesting," Silas said, nodding slowly. "All right then, let's talk terms. You come with us, nice and quiet. We'll even let you ride your own horse back to Laramie. You'll get a trial, and then you'll get a rope." The offer hung in the freezing air. Eleanor's knuckles were white on the stock of the rifle. A trial, a rope, a public spectacle, just like his friend Tom. Jesse's gaze was fixed on Silas, his face a mask of stone. He was a man trapped, with no way out. "A rope's not an option for me," Jesse said, his voice a low growl. "It's the only option you've got, Hale," Silas sneered. Jesse's eyes flickered to Eleanor for a fraction of a second. In that one look, she saw it all. The love, the regret, the decision. He had run once and lived with the shame of it for years. He wouldn't run again. He wouldn't die in a cage. "Maybe," Jesse said, his voice dropping even lower, "but I won't die on their gallows." He shifted his weight just slightly onto the balls of his feet. His hand, which had been hanging loosely at his side, began to tense. In that single frozen moment, the choice was made. He was going to fight. He was going to die. and he was going to do it right here. The morning held its breath. The sun was a pale, useless disk in the sky. It was 3 guns to 1. 4 if you counted Eleanor. But she knew the truth. Her holding this rifle was a gesture, nothing more. The real fight was between the men in the yard. The mathematics of violence were simple and cruel. Jesse's hand dropped. It was a blur of motion, faster than Eleanor could have imagined. The Colt cleared the leather in a single, fluid draw, a move perfected through countless hours of practice in lonely, desperate places. In another time, against another man, it might have been enough. But Silas Boone hadn't gotten old by being slow. He had worn a badge for 15 years before turning to bounties, and his instincts were honed to a razor's edge. Silas's gun barked a split second before Jesse's was even level. The shot echoed through the valley like a clap of thunder. The bullet hit Jesse high in the chest, spinning him around with its force. He staggered back a step, a look of surprise on his face, before his legs gave out and he crumpled to the frozen ground. His unfired Colt skittered across the yard, coming to rest in a patch of pristine snow. A patch of snow that was now rapidly turning a sickening, dark red. "No!" The scream was torn from Eleanor's throat, a raw, animal sound of pure agony. She didn't even remember dropping the Winchester. She was just running, stumbling across the yard to his side. He was lying in the dirt, the front of Jacob's wool coat already soaked with blood. "Eleanor!" His voice was a faint whisper, barely a breath. His gray eyes, cloudy with pain, struggled to focus on her face as she knelt beside him. I didn't run." Tears she hadn't shed in 7 years, not even for Jacob, streamed down her face, carving hot tracks in her cold skin. "I know," she choked out, her voice thick with grief. "I know, my love. I know." His hand, already slick with his own blood, found hers. His grip was weak, but he held on. "This time, I stayed." His eyes fluttered. His chest gave one last shallow rise. And then the hand in hers went still. For a long moment, Eleanor just knelt there in the cold, hard dirt of her yard, holding a dead man's hand. The crushing weight of her loneliness, the solitude she had mistaken for peace, crashed back down on her like a winter avalanche. But underneath the tidal wave of grief, a strange, new feeling began to burn. It was pride, a fierce, burning pride. Jesse Hale hadn't died like a coward. He had died like a man who had finally found something worth staying for. The crunch of boots on snow broke the silence. Silas Boone walked over slowly, his smoking Colt still held loosely at his side. He looked down at Jesse, then at Eleanor. "By the letter of the law," he said, his voice flat and devoid of its earlier malice, "I should arrest you for harboring a fugitive, ma'am." Eleanor looked up at him, her eyes blazing through her tears. "Then do it." Silas studied her face for a long time. He saw the defiance there, mixed with a devastation so complete it was almost terrifying. He saw the way she cradled Jesse's hand, as if it were the most precious thing in the world. And something in the bounty hunter's cold, hard expression seemed to shift. It was almost as if a flicker of some long-forgotten humanity had sparked back to life. "Funny thing about the law," he said finally, holstering his pistol. "Sometimes it just gets in the way of justice." He knelt down on the other side of Jesse's body. With a surprising gentleness, he reached out and closed Jesse's unseeing eyes. He looked across the body at Eleanor. "I don't see a fugitive here," he said quietly. "All I see is a widow woman living out here alone, tending to her property." He stood up and gestured to his other 2 men, who had been watching the whole scene in silence. He turned back to Eleanor one last time and touched the brim of his hat. It wasn't a gesture of assessment this time. It was a gesture of respect. "Bury him deep," he advised, his voice low. "The wolves come down from the mountains this time of year." Eleanor watched as the 3 bounty hunters mounted their horses and rode away, disappearing back into the dense pine forest from which they had come. The yard fell silent again. The only sounds were the whisper of the wind through the bare aspen trees and the lonely, distant cry of a hawk circling high overhead. She buried him on the spot where they had practiced shooting, the spot where he had kissed her for the first time. She dug the grave herself, her body fueled by grief and a grim, newfound strength. She worked until her hands were raw and bleeding, the frozen ground fighting her every inch of the way. There was no headstone, no carved marker, just a small pile of rocks. And tied to the branch of a nearby juniper tree, she left his red bandana, a single splash of color against the stark Wyoming landscape. In a town like Dry Willow, questions were a dangerous currency, and some secrets were better left buried in the cold, hard earth. Prue Landon, of course, tried to pry. She showed up with a casserole and 100 questions veiled as condolences for some unnamed trouble she'd heard about. But Eleanor had learned the art of silence. She accepted the casserole, offered a polite but empty thank you, and revealed nothing. She mended her clothes. She tended her garden. And she spoke only when spoken to. But things had changed. The changes were small, almost unnoticeable to the outside world, but to Eleanor they were seismic. She kept the Winchester clean and loaded, always within arm's reach. She planted a window box full of bright red wildflowers, the first flowers she had grown since Jacob's death. Once a month, she started taking the train to Cheyenne. She bought books and soft fabrics and other small luxuries she had denied herself for 7 years. And she never ever wore her wedding ring again. Spring came late to the valley that year, but it did come. The snow melted, the creeks began to rush with clear, cold water, and the meadowlarks returned, their songs filling the air. One morning, Eleanor stood on her porch, a mug of coffee in her hands, watching the world come back to life. In the distance, she could see the juniper tree. The red bandana was still there, faded by the sun and whipped by the wind, but holding fast. She thought about Jesse every day, not with the sharp, stabbing pain of fresh grief anymore, but with a quiet, lingering warmth. She remembered the rough feel of his hand, the sound of his laugh, the look in his eyes when he told her she was beautiful. She remembered the weight of his final choice, to stay. Some loves, she realized, are measured in years, built slowly over a lifetime. Others are measured in heartbeats, a blazing fire that changes everything in a single night. She had spent 7 years believing her life was over, that she was too old, too set in her ways, too broken for passion. Jesse Hale had taught her otherwise. He had shown her that courage wasn't about not being afraid. It was about being terrified and choosing to act anyway. Eleanor Whitlow lived for another 23 years in that small cabin on the edge of the wilderness. She never remarried. But in her heart, she was never truly alone again, because a love like that, once it's been kindled, burns forever, even when the man who lit the flame is resting peacefully under the cold Wyoming soil. Thank you for listening to this story of a love that defied the odds and a choice that defined a lifetime. If this story moved you, please hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the untamed heart of the American frontier. And before you go, let me know in the comments below, where in the world are you listening from tonight?